Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexis Smith. I'm the Chief of Staff and Assistant Vice President for Special Initiatives at Manhattan School of Music, which is a private American conservatory in New York City. I'm thrilled to be here today, and a big thanks to the Hampsong Foundation and to IDAGIO for hosting us. Today will be a wonderful discussion with two artists at the top of their game, Damien Sneed and Carlos Simon. Our discussion today is called Black Classical Music, a Future Free of Labels. It's something we brainstormed about, and I think it hits a lot of the marks that are on a lot of people's minds today. So with that, I want to get us started here. So one thing the three of us have in common is that we're all a part of the Sphinx Foundation, Sphinx Organization family. And the Sphinx Organization has a mission of transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. Not only does the organization support lots of young artists of color through their various programs from grade school up and their competition, but I also have been the beneficiary of one of their newer programs called the LEAD program, which supports arts administrators of color through mentorship and funding and retreats to institutions across the US. Our guests for this conversation are both recipients of the highest accolade that the Sphinx Organization gives, which is the Sphinx Medal of Excellence. And with that, I want to introduce my colleagues here. So Damien Snead was the 2014 recipient of the Sphinx Medal of Excellence, and he's a pianist, composer, conductor, and I'm lucky enough to call him a colleague because he's on the faculty at Manhattan School of Music. He's worked with jazz, classical, pop, and R&B legends from Aretha Franklin to Jussie Norman, just to name a few. And Damien, I can't wait to get into those genres with you, by the way. So Damien Sneed, welcome today.
Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here with my friends and colleagues.
Carlos Simon is the 2021 Sphinx Medal of Excellence winner. And he's an in-demand composer, and his music ranges from concert music, large and small ensembles, to film scores with influences of jazz, gospel, and neo-romanticism. And he's also a fellow educator, so we're going to talk a little bit about that too. Carlos Simon, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so honored to be here and looking forward to the discussion today.
So I think we should start with our roots, because I think when we talk about, the Black experience in the States, where we come from really shapes where we end up, especially musically. So in terms of your musical roots, can you each tell us, maybe we'll start with Carlos, about your early musical influences and how it led you to classical music?
Sure. Well, I'm a son of a preacher. In fact, I come from a long lineage of preachers. My grandfather was a preacher, great grandfather was a preacher. I grew up in that tradition of the Pentecostal church. So if you know anything about the Pentecostal church, it's a very spontaneous style of worship. And music goes along with that. With the worship service. So, and my family, they very musical people, and singers and pianists, and all play by ear, and sing by ear. So it's one of these things where music was sort of embedded into my DNA, if you will. It's like you have to do something in church. If you are part of the Simon family, you had to do something. You had to sing. You had to play an instrument. You had to direct a choir or something like that. And so I kind of gravitated to the piano and organ, and I started learning by ear, learning just basic songs, and with help from my uncles and other family members who played the piano. But I would just sort of learn everything by ear. And that wasn't until college, and well into high school, that I really started to learn how to read music and learn formal music theory and all these things and I could actually place a name to some of the things that I was writing or some of the things that I was, playing on the piano at that time. So that's how I actually started. I started in church. I started writing for the choir, and teaching them parts and that sort of thing. So church is the beginning for me. always. And I always go back to that whenever I write music. You know, the harmonic language may be different, but I always go back to the intent and to the emotion of church. It never leaves.
Yes. Damien, how about you?
For me, I grew up in Augusta, Georgia. We both grew up in Georgia, in the church as well. A little different. I grew up in the Baptist church, and I did not really start playing by ear until maybe 7th or 8th grade, when I got exposed to Pentecostal worship in the church by attending what we called citywide workshops and things like that. And I fell in love with the spontaneity of the music, as we had spontaneity with my Baptist church. But for me, I started off reading music and started taking piano lessons around 4.5. So my ear was very underdeveloped. And by the time I got to high school and then college, that's when I really started seeing more development with my ear and learning music just by listening to a recording, things like that. I remember the first gospel song that I learned from a recording was in 9th grade. I remember it was like a large celebration, me and the choir director and one of the other musicians, because I finally learned the song without having to have sheet music. But for me, that's the beginning, and just being exposed to lots of music, because my father, who had been previously in the military, would force me to listen to Eugene Ormandy, to listen to Hall & Oates, to listen to Michael Jackson, Patti LaBelle, Bobby Blue Bland. I mean, a large variety of music. And I also had to perform in front of him and my mother, or the neighbors, had to sing the songs and try to imitate Wham or, Boy George, different people, Madonna. So for me, music has never had silos. It's just been music, and all music was good music growing up.
Yeah. I want to point out, because we have a global audience today, maybe for both of you, you can explain the organ, for example, in church music, because, from a European perspective, it's very different when you're in a Black church, like what the organ is. So maybe you can both talk about that for our audiences who may not understand how it's different.
Well, I think that organ, I like to think of it as underscoring, like a film underscoring. You hear the orchestra, but you don't really know it's there until, a moment happens, it's so that we think about the organ. It's not the pipe organ. It's the Hammond organ, which is a different. It's electronic, kind of developed in popularity in the 60s, 50s, and the 60s. But instead of the smaller churches couldn't afford a huge pipe organ, with massive pipes and glorious, but the smaller churches could afford a Hammond organ, which was a fraction of the price. But the role of the organ in these Pentecostal churches, Black churches, it's really just to kind of highlight the emotion and the worship and the spontaneity. I mean, there have been many times where, my dad would be preaching and he would start off kind of soft. And then he would just say one thing like, God can. And then the organ, that would be my cue to, like, hit a certain note or hit a certain way, pull out the drawbars, and that kind of, move the service in a different direction where people get up and start dancing and shouting and praise God, amen. But that moment where the organ sort of cueing a different dramatic moment, if you will. But you have to be in tune. You have to be very aware of what's going on and have the language already at your fingertips. So
Yes.
forces you to be on your toes.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And to me, like, I think about when you're doing like Mozart operas and you have all those pages of recitative. And if you don't have that like good harpsichord player who can like react, if you feel like going a different way as Susanna tonight and they give you a little punch and you're like, oh, okay. Like for me, I always felt when I was working on those types of operas, it's the same type of relationship you need,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's definitely a relationship for sure. And it's all improvised. It's nothing planned. And although maybe there's certain things that they become routine, but for the most part, it is improvised in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Me,
yeah, go ahead.
For me, it was a little different. I played at a lot of different denominations, different churches. So my church, we had a Lowry organ, you know, it lit up and stuff like that. My organ, we were only allowed to play it with choir music for gospel. But then at some churches, I had to learn, you know, substitutions with pipe organ, and they would use the pipe organ for an introit, maybe the benediction, but trying to play gospel music with the pipe organ, I had to learn how to release quickly because of the delay and what the singers are leading the hymn. And then I didn't get exposed to the Hammond organ until I was in 9th grade. I remember it and I was like, wow, what is this? And there's something Carlos mentioned that they used to call, or they still do call, talking music, which is like an underscore, you know, when someone's giving the announcements, because you never know when the spirit is going to come in and you have to be ready to pull out the drawbars or add more instrumentation, you know. But yeah, so the organ is a staple, though, I think, of the Black church, especially now, and gospel music. It creates the river or the flow of connectivity with the spirit.
So I want to pivot a little bit to something we talked about preparing for today, which is this idea that people have that, like, Black people don't like classical music. And, you know, clearly we all do. And, you know, and in my experience, it can be sort of common. So I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about where that comes from, and also, like, how do we move away from it, or how do we talk differently about it? Because I think it's not a real narrative, but there are some things there. And I think when you're drawing these parallels between what you do and where you came from, it makes total sense why you love classical music in this way and why you want to create things there. But how should we start thinking about that differently? Carlos, we'll go to you first.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about the word classical, you know, the classical music, it's loaded already, right? It's you know, we think about it, for musicians, it's this era of, you know, opulence and grandeur, and associated with a certain lifestyle, right, of elitism, and even certain composers, a certain style, Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart, basically, and classical music, classical. It's the term itself is loaded, and with, you know, a certain social cues. And, you know, I didn't grow up going to classical music concerts just because my parents couldn't afford a ticket, you know, to hear an orchestra. And even when we got there, it was like, you know, nobody looked like us. So it was like, you know, until later on when I experienced it, it was like, wow, you know, I'm like the only Black person here. And so it was off-putting, you know, but I loved the music, and I kept going just because I loved the music. But the whole idea of, you know, music is a social activity, you know, you want to enjoy with other people. And if you don't have that connection, and that connection with the lifestyle, and it can be off-putting to people. So, but the whole notion that Black people don't like classical music it's completely false. You know, I love classical music. It's all the other things that are associated with it that come, the elitism and this lifestyle I don't necessarily connect with. But Damien, you may have a different perspective on this.
For me, classical music was always in front of me because, as I say a lot, Jessie Norman sang at my parents' wedding when she was a freshman at Howard. So I was always pointed to watch live from Lincoln Center. But I experienced this as at a very young age as a child, playing classical piano. I was in 5th grade, I remember, at my performing arts school, and several of my friends, we were really close friends. I went to their homes, they came to my home for parties. But when it came time for the annual piano competition in Augusta, before we went to the state level, they actually said to me, "You're not supposed to be in this competition. You're Black." And we never had that issue about race or color or culture. These are like my friends. It didn't matter our race. And I said, "What do you mean?" And one of my close friends said to me, "Well, you know, you're supposed to play Black people's music, church music, and I'm going to beat the snots out of you." And it really hurt me because we were close friends. And I remember telling my parents called her parents, and, you know, our relationship sort of was, you know, really different after that. However, that's something I always had to try to prove or disprove, that as a Black person, I could do classical music. I remember when I won the Georgia State Classical Piano Competition, a lot of those people got mad with me and stopped speaking to me. Those people meaning my friends, to be very clear. But what happened when I got to New York City, there was a Black group of people or people of color who told me, as a Black man, you will never, they literally said this, they said, you'll never get into Manhattan School of Music. You'll never perform at Carnegie Hall. The best thing for you to do is learn jazz, tap your foot and do blues music, or do gospel in a church. As a Black man, even when I went to Howard University at HBCU, one of my professors argued with me and said, you should not major in classical music. As a Black man, Andre Watts was a one in a kind. No one else will ever be like Andre Watts. Then they found out about Awa Dodgen practice as a pianist. And they literally told me, and they weren't being rude in their mind, they were being honest and they thought they were showing concern. You should not pursue classical music. It will never happen. So it's interesting now, those people who come to some of the performances or reach out to me, I don't hold any grudges against them. And it's not that everything I do is to disprove that, but I realize that I am a beacon of light for other people that look like me, or other people that may not even be Black, who may not be what people think classical music is, European, and just to show that anybody can become anything that they want to be.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, luckily for someone like you, Damien, that pressure pushed you to excel in some ways, but it can be really damaging and demoralizing to other people. And I think, all of us who we're educators now, we think of trying to help students get here and to New York and performing, not in spite of all of the things against them, and making clear paths so everyone can at least have a shot. So it's not that I had to plow through to get here. It's like, okay, I want to try and do this. And there's lots of avenues for it. I think about that as an administrator walking around in the halls. Like, I try and be very visible because there may be that person that's like, I don't know if I want to be on stage. I might want to be behind the scenes. And they've got to see that too. I can't just be in my office with the door closed all day. But yeah, I think you brought a lot of good points, and it's time for us to not deal with the resistance all the time, so we can actually get to work and create. And I want to talk a little bit about genres now, because I think, to both of your points, and there's a lot of value in using labels and genres to help others maybe identify what they might be hearing, the flavors that they're hearing and all that. But how should we be thinking about genres? Like, what's important to each of you when it comes to those types of labels? Sorry, Carlos.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard. Genres are hard for me. Even like teaching genre, like when I have teach music theory at the very beginning, one of the things we talk about is genre. How do we classify? What are some of the things that we use to classify a piece of music? And it's so hard because a lot of times it's like blending, and it's like a gumbo oftentimes of music. So, but when it comes to my music, I always come back to the emotion in the story of what I wanted to say, the things I want to say. And I tend to use a style that best serves the story of the concept. For instance, I wrote a piece called White Only, Colored Only, which was about, I heard a speech, a famous speech by George Wallace when he was inaugurated as governor of Alabama.
Right.
And there was a moment in there where he says, separation forever, basically, paraphrasing. And of course, you hear these people cheering that on. This was like 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I'd heard it, but for some reason it hit me, it hit me in a different way. And so I chose to use a jazz ensemble, and have them play, respond to, as the speech is going on. I had them respond to the speech musically, and wow. I gave them certain parameters to emote from that, so I chose jazz free jazz or jazz without any particular harmonic, or melodic constraints. And I think that's the style that I chose because it was indicative or helpful. It served the story, or it served the concept that I wanted to create. It's like this chaos. It's just like upside down world, where I see it as crazy, and a lot would be surprised. A lot of people don't know. A lot of people my age, my generation, don't know about George Wallace. And so that's just one example where genre doesn't really, genre serves the story for me.
Mm-hmm. Damien?
Well, for me, when I think about genre and defining the word genre, a lot of times it is a silo or a box created for commercialization, for the sake of censorship, placing people in certain categories for prizes, for awards, and to music that's at one time was to a certain demographic or certain culture. For me, it's interesting because I use all musical styles and genres for my palette with which I paint from, if I'm trying to describe something. But for example, my opera that I just recently wrote, The Tongue and the Lash, about James Baldwin and William Buckley's debate, it's interesting. Jessie Norman always said pigeonholes are for pigeons, but she also told me, never read your critics, never read what they're saying about you. But it's funny, some people describe the opera as jazz, maybe fused with classical, or they said it was gospel or gospelized, and so the genre becomes whatever that person recognizes or what they've been taught or what information has been placed inside of their register, so then they can describe what they think they're hearing. But what's so interesting is after my opera, one night I was talking to a well-known opera personality. I won't say who it is, at the Cast Versions. And again, I did not receive it negatively. I could have. And they came up to me right after and said, "Oh, your opera was amazing. I love that little jive you put in it." And that's the way they said it, jive. And I thought about the movie Airplane with Leslie Nielsen. I said, okay, that's what it's like, that jive turkey. And I thought about it. I said, some people don't know the right language to describe what it is they're sensing. And I guess to them, the music was jive, and I didn't take that offensively, but it's so interesting, these genres and these words and adjectives that are used to describe and place us in boxes. And that's why I'm so proud of my brother and my friend Carlos, great person, because he's doing it on a high level. And like when I'm in class teaching at Manhattan School of Music, I'm able to present him and say, look, he's a composer in residence for the National Symphony Orchestra, for the Washington National Opera. He's done film scoring. He comes out of the church. He's got all these things. He's doing it at a very high level. And it's not just one or two people, but now we're seeing more people who are doing different musical styles and genres, and particularly people of color. So it's a great thing. So I celebrate him and others that are doing that, so that, as you said, Alexa, there are other people that have different stories, but that they can come into this profession and they can feel comfortable with whatever their culture or their roots are. They can feel comfortable singing their own folk music, whether it's blues or whether it's Maori songs, from the Aboriginal people. No matter what it is, they can feel comfortable being themselves, and then still being transcendent to portray different characters, stand in different roles, step into different postures. So yeah, that's just interesting. My jive.
Yeah. And, I think because now we're hearing more things, right? I mean, in a couple of weeks, we're going to get to see a Black composer at the Metropolitan Opera, with a different musical palette, and not just musical palette. It's also one of the directors is Black. The movement on stage is going to be something totally different than we've seen on that stage before. And so with more of that, it feels like people will start to have more ways to describe what they're hearing. They'll be a little more nuanced with it, one would hope. But I do think that the exposure and really just like the number of options is really important, because if you only have one thing to latch on and it is Porgy and it's not even by Black people, it's just that one thing for you, so so how can you be expected to react differently if we haven't provided other things for you to experience? And I'm really thrilled as we see theaters coming back online and orchestras back on stages, that there's going to be so many more opportunities for our audiences, so that they won't come up to you after an opera and say that. And
It's
to
a great.
that, I want to talk a little bit about programming, the future of programming. We saw a lot of companies, rightfully so, pressed to start programming more diversity in composers and stories, and starting to find their way and how it might look different after 2020. So I think we all came to this space with a love of traditional classical music in a way. I mean, I was a violinist first. Like, I could not wait till I could play Mozart and Beethoven and like sit in an orchestra and like play Beethoven 3 or Rite of Spring. Like, these are the things I love. And there's too much of it. And I think there's this fear that all of that might be taken away, and that's maybe what we want. And I think it's not what we want, right? So what does that programming look like? Like Carlos, when you're looking at things you're programmed next to, what are you thinking about?
I mean, I'm always grateful when someone programs my music, and I'm just overjoyed. I'm also like very happy that oftentimes it's programmed with Beethoven and Mozart. It's so trippy to see my name like sandwiched in between. For instance, the last concert was Sibelius and I think Mendelssohn. It was a Mendelssohn violin concerto, and it's like my name was sandwiched in there. So it was honestly very trippy. But I think we live in America, right? And like when you go to hear in an orchestra, oftentimes they're playing European composers or music by white European males. And is that representative of our American culture at the moment? No, it's not, but yet we have people who want to hear that music, and it for whatever reason. But I do think concerts should represent, programming should represent our culture, our time. The Nina Simone quote, art should reflect the time in which we live. And then the programming, I think, should be a reflective of that. But I am overjoyed whenever the situation is, when my music is programmed. It doesn't matter where or who or what orchestra, what ensemble. It's just amazing that I get a chance to do this and make a living and help someone else. So that's what I think about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Damien, what are your thoughts on programming?
It's a great conversation. I've been having this on a lot of platforms like this. I think we also need to hear from more female composers. People like Valerie Coleman and Kuru Okoye and Jessie Montgomery, just to name a few of my friends. But also, I've heard this conversation go several ways. With people will say, well, we can't perform the music of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, or people from the African and African American diasporic community because it's not published. Well, that's true, but that's the same way that a student writes something and a school or university will still perform it. So it can be published. There's an answer and there's a solvent to that. And then also people say, well, we can't do this music because it's not really the same. But I think a lot of times that's fear, because people are more familiar with the traditional literature that's been recorded 50,000 times by, 190,000 people. I know that sounds crazy. The numbers are off. And sometimes people are afraid to approach new things because they're afraid it may show something in their technique or something in their musicality or this presentation that they've built as an artist extraordinaire, that they can't appropriate different musical styles. They can't learn new motifs and new types of ways of speaking musically, that, well, it has to be this way, and this the way this teacher did it, and she told my teacher and he told them. And so what becomes more apparent is people are just imitators, robots, assimilation, like the Borg from Star Trek. I'm a Trekkie. So it's like people begin to just imitate. And so we're just creating robots. We're creating people to do the same thing. Crescendo here, hold here, wait here, cadenza here, up, hit that note. Nope, you have to do this. And so then there's the level of expression and creativity is singed, and it's decreased, and it's diminished, because people have to only do things the way it was done. And I think it's important to program living composers and for people to experience a living composer. And the orchestra, okay, we're going to fix that. In 2 days, you're going to have a new score. Or at the same time, like an hour later, we're going to take a break. Let's go to the Schubert or the Bartok. Then they come back and print something out, or if they have iPads and they try something new. People are afraid of the new because it's not something, it allows you to be transparent. And then you, as Wynton Marsalis said, you have to bare your soul and testify. But people don't like transparency. They want to be prepared. They're not used to reading something fresh and not knowing something and having to talk to a composer or find out, well, what does this mean? Or what is the culture? What is the story of this character? I don't know that character. That's not like the other characters. This character has too much pain. I don't want to embrace pain. I only want to talk about love and my tender life. You see what I'm saying? It's those types of things. But I think it's important that institutions bring people like a Carlos Simon, like a Damien Snead. I'm not, patting myself in the back, but like an Alexis Smith, other universities, places, people who have knowledge, it's their roots, it's their culture, but also they're able to communicate this. So there's a more of a balanced picture and a more wider, global, macro depiction and painting of culture and art and creativity and expression.
Yeah, you make a great point about our culture within classical music, especially in education, is sort of iterative, and it's not necessarily like proactive in creativity, and we're getting to a place where we really have to push students to be creative, which for musicians is sort of problematic, like, and you all know as well as I, like, they come here not as empty vessels for us to fill. They're coming here with lots of experience, lots of things to bring to a stage. And we haven't been good at asking them to do that, which is why, probably they're becoming audience members, future audience members who are going to be looking for the same things the past generations have when they look at a program. And I'm excited to say that we have programs Carlos Simon this year at MSM, which will be great. And we'll have to get you up to the school, but
absolutely.
Yeah, great points. And going back to the classroom, we were talking about music theory. You all both have done really interesting work with your students in helping them understand, basic music theory concepts when they're coming to higher ed, but not necessarily using, Bach chorales or sort of the traditional techniques. Carlos, I know you have some really fun examples, and it'd be great for you to share sort of the ideas you have with that.
Sure. Yeah. When I was teaching music theory, I would, it's basically teaching the canon, and the basic, concepts that, or names that be able to call a chord a certain thing, a C major or whatever. But a lot of times, I have students who from varying skill levels, people who have never read music or never actually, learn how to read music, but from students who, have been taking piano lessons for 10 years. And they come from varying backgrounds, and they have musical interests, for instance. And so I've tried to craft my lessons, my classes, in a way that caters to the students. So at the very beginning of the class, I asked them to give me 3 pieces that they listen to, their favorite pieces. And I go, as a professor, I go and listen to all those pieces. And I try to find different concepts to highlight within those pieces. And I may bring in 1 or 2 each class. So if I'm teaching class on modulations, for instance, of course, I'll bring in the Bach chorale. You know, we go from modulation from C major to G major, and I'll show the pivot chord. Okay, and then I'll say, okay, here's a Beyonce, Love on Top, where she's modulating and she goes by half step, you know, and it shows a different, not only musical style, but also it shows, you know, we can go into performance practice, we can go into musical style and all these things. So it's making teaching in a way multidimensional. It's not just through the lens of the Western canon, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really helpful to students to see that.
Yeah, Damien,
Yeah,
I know what your classroom is like, so share a little bit.
It's important to make sure that there's a point of entry that's welcoming for students.
Yes.
Particularly when you're presenting a new aesthetic, a new principle, a new idea. So for me, like with music theory, it should be touchable, palpable. It should be something that they already feel, because then it can sort of intrinsically give them confidence that they can approach more difficult, you know, theoretical principles like Neapolitan sixth, or, you know, things that people save for a later time, or counterpoint. So for example, like Stevie Wonder's Sir Duke deals with like half steps and how ear training, like how to hear and how to sing, things like that. And I used to do in one of my theory classes, I would actually, at the beginning of each class, I'd put myself in the spot and I'd say, someone bring a song. I'd call on someone and they'd name the song. We'd pull it up on YouTube or Spotify in the class. We'd play it. And then I would transcribe at least like 3 or 4 measures of it on the spot and have them help me, or have students come up. But Carlos is right. Something about classical music, and he didn't say this, but I'll say this to say why he was right. Classical music used to be very prescient. It was like the popular music of the day. People enjoyed improvisation. They enjoyed seeing people create things on the spot. Now it's become more of a museum piece for people. But like he said, I think it's important that people are able to see that modern music today contains the same theoretical elements as far as music theory that a Bach chorale does, or a Beethoven symphony, or, you know, a Liszt sonata. It's all in there. It's all the same. The notes may be arpeggiated, or things may be approached by skip or step. But when they find that out and they find this new jargon, which goes back to the first thing you were saying, or your first question about, is classical music attainable, or is it with our culture, why don't more people of color love classical music or like classical music? Because there's certain vocabulary and jargon and certain things that are just mysticized, I guess that's the way to say it, where people think, oh, because of all this language, and okay, let's forget the language. I'll give you a synonym. Well, we'll figure out a way, if I'm speaking to the student, for them to learn it. And then once they have their own way of saying it, okay, now replace that word with this, or replace that concept or that formula. It's interesting because a lot of people don't teach like that, because there's several schools of teaching when it comes to music theory. In every school, they go by this college, or they go by this way, or this book, or this writer. And so then, you know, you have to teach it this way, you have to teach it in this order. And sometimes that doesn't work for everybody, because some creatives like myself, I'm autistic on the spectrum. You know, we have different ways of learning. Some people are slightly dyslexic. Some people have different ways of putting information in the brain and then putting it back out. So, you know, that's something that I think with popular music, like pop, R&B, hip hop, people feel welcome. There's no educational achievement, level of achievement that a person has to have to just enjoy the music. They can just dance. It's like food. It's like good food. You can eat it. It's not like you have to be screened and tested and vetted just to get in to enjoy the music, so to speak. And I think that may be what could help if we take away the veil of the vetting and the veil of you have to respond this way to the music. Let people respond somewhat how they want to. They can be cultured or inculcated on when to give applause and when to wait and when to sit. But let people enjoy the music. Let them feel it. Music should have response. No, you can't do that. No, don't dance to the music. No, sit still. You know, and so that's why people are like, I can't deal with this, because I'm feeling it. I love classical music, but now you're telling me I have to respond in a certain way, which means you want me to follow a certain tradition that somebody did 300, 400 years ago, when wearing their corset or wearing their feudal clothing, or whatever they're doing, so I have to do that instead of just being myself. And I think if that doesn't happen, classical music will die. But it won't die because people like Carlos and myself are still creating music that will be classical in a few years, because we're going to be older eventually, and then traditional. But I'm talking about what we know today as classical music. It has to be more reachable, more attainable, more access is the word. Has to be a welcoming point of entry.
Yeah, and I think too.
Go ahead, Carlos.
Sorry. And I think too that it's when you reach students where they are, and sort of lift that veil and saying, that this is my composers, for instance, the composers that I teach, they come in and say, I don't know how to write for orchestra. Everybody that I know, Bach or Beethoven, it's not attainable. It doesn't seem attainable. But then I show them, other composers, William Grant Still and Hale Smith and T.J. Anderson and and Margaret Bonds. I used to teach at Spelman, which is African American school that caters for women, and I would show them Florence Price and Margaret Bonds and these composers, Black female composers. It was so eye-opening, and so having a model, I think. Having models that say, okay, this is where it comes from. You are part of this lineage now, as a composer. That sense of belonging, you just have no idea how much that actually means to a young musician to see someone, 50 or 60 years doing it, did it, and, was successful at it, but yet we didn't get the certain amount of recognition, it's getting now, of course, Margaret Bonds and Florence Price, but, that's something to build on, and I think that as a teacher, you have to be willing to expose students to these examples and models for sure, because it's important.
I couldn't agree more. And I remember the first time I went to the Gateways Festival, which is it's a really wonderful festival in New York with an all-Black orchestra and lots of chamber music. And I saw Kelly Hall Tompkins was doing a concerto with the chamber orchestra. And Kelly Hall Tompkins, she's on faculty here at Manhattan School of Music, and she's a Black woman. And I had this whole wave of emotions watching her, because I played violin as a kid, but really all I could see was like Itzhak Perlman and then like maybe like Josh Bell later and Hilary Hahn. And I didn't even realize that I couldn't see it. So I just assumed it wasn't possible. That thought didn't even get there, because it was just like a part of me, like, okay. But then in singing, I found like Jessie, Leontine, Martina, like right away. And I was like, oh, okay, I could do that. Okay, there's people there already that have been there. So maybe that's possible. But I'm grateful that now we have so many people, and, we didn't have like Zoom concerts where I could have in Kentucky growing up seeing a Kelly Hall Tompkins. And now it's so important to us in classical music to make sure that's available. So I'm with y'all. I'm feeling very hopeful. Before we close out here, I just want to give you each a moment to talk about what's coming up for you, what you're doing next. Damien, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about your opera at Opera Theater St. Louis this summer and what that was like, and other projects that are coming up for you.
So I just wrote an opera with a phenomenal librettist, African-American female, Karen Chilton, and it's called The Tongue on the Lash. And it takes place right at the end of the 1965 debate between James Baldwin and William Buckley. It featured Markel Reed and Jonathan Johnson playing those two characters. And it was phenomenal at the Opera Theater of St. Louis this summer for the festival, with Daniela Candelari conducting. And it's available now. If people are watching this during the month of September 2021. I'm not sure when you're watching this, wherever you are, whatever place and time. It could be 100 years from now. But it's available online. Perhaps by then it'll still be available. I have a couple things coming up. I'm excited about a project that's going to kick off the Library of Congress virtual season. I'm conducting my mentor, Wynton Marsalis's Fiddler's Tale, and they're also performing Stravinsky's Soldier's Tale. And it incorporates principles like Anthony McGill from the New York Philharmonic, principles like Billy Hunter from the Metropolitan Opera, trumpet player, and Weston Sprott, the Metropolitan Opera principals, and also Javon, who plays timpani, I believe, with the National Symphony Orchestra. But it's featuring all Black musicians and ensemble. And then I'm also playing piano with the great violinist from who's been living in Germany, who now is teaching at Yale, Ty Murray, who's I believe the very first Sphinx competition winner violinist.
Oh, wow.
Doing some Zwilish, but that's coming up. And then I have a lot of other performances coming up, and I'm doing a commission for the March on Washington Film Festival for writing something for piano trio. But that's just the things coming up this month. Yeah.
Fantastic. Carlos, what you got coming up next?
Well, let me just say before I say that, if you haven't seen Damien Sneed's opera, it's really amazing. You should definitely check it out. It's playing for all month. But wow. I checked, it's really amazing. It's really great. But I'm composer in residence at Kennedy Center, so there are a few things coming up with that. And I just finished orchestrating an opera, which will premiere March 2022, featuring Janae Bridges, and the libretto is written by Mark Joseph Bamuthi, and it's a 30-minute opera, and it's meant to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy Center. And I've used the Supreme Court as a monument they asked me to write a piece about a monument and having the story of a monument having a backdrop of the story. So I used the Supreme Court, and it's really centered around the Black church, and I had to go back to my roots, and yeah, so I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm just finished the orchestration. I'm very happy to say it took a lot out of me, but I'm excited to release it finally.
Very exciting. I just have to say, Janae Bridges, Manhattan School of Music alumna. We love her.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right.
Well, that's wonderful. On that hopeful note, I want to thank both of you for joining us. Thank you to Adagio for being our gracious host, especially to Thomas Hampson, who's a real champion in this field. So big thanks to you, Thomas. And of course, the Sphinx Organization for bringing us all together. It's the 25th anniversary this year. So they've been doing this work a long, long time. And we're really grateful for the opportunities they've given to so many of us. So thank you to them as well. Thank you for everyone who's joining us from around the world. And we'll see you next time.